hey there, kids. Guess what? It's Freaky Friday again, and today we're going to get a little bit boppy about our freakiness.
Oh, no, we're not.
Yeah, it's boppy.
No, it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
No, it isn't. The reason I say that is because we're going to morph a little bit from ghosts to the concept of vampires. And
Boppy. See, I told you.
I know, it kind of seems like that if you've been watching movies over the last, I don't know how long, but with the appearance and the very cool success of the new movie Sinners, and starring Michael B. Jordan and Haley Steinfeld.
The basketball player?
Is that? No. No. The actor that was in Black Panther and
right.
those shows. Excellent. He was in Creed. And so apparently the movie is getting a lot of critical acclaim and people are loving it. And so I thought with that, it might be kind of interesting to trace back a little bit of vampire lore. I mean, we know what we know from the Twilight series and from Anne Rice's books.
That's what I meant by Boppy.
Oh, okay, I get it. But you know what? That's not a recent phenomenon.
No, not at all.
If you remember the movie Nosferatu, it's, a Dracula movie. Mm-hmm. And that had a lot of old Romanian lore that was pretty much on target with the sensibility of who and what vampires were in early times, what people believed. And in Romania, over the last good while, they've been unearthing graves that have stakes driven through what would be the heart of the corpse, or the caskets being completely encased in an iron cage, or the corpse itself, that what now would be the skeleton, draped with heavy, heavy iron chains. And so all of these things pointed to a very, very strong popular belief that the dead could rise again and basically suck the life out of the living. And so these things are very disconcerting, I think is a good way to put it, because when you see how popular those feelings were or must have been, it causes you to have to kind of retrace your steps a little bit and try to understand, how could people be so convinced that that was something that they needed to fear? And I was reading in one of my books, and it kind of struck me because it was very obvious. It should be sort of a duh to me and you and everybody. Think about it. We come in from the dark parking lot, and we go in through our door, and the first thing we do is flip on a light switch, and that makes the darkness go away. And the street lamps, they hold the darkness at bay. And all of these things that we just take for granted, they didn't have that. Now, I have to say, if you're a city dweller, you don't know what darkness is. You think you do, but you don't. And I didn't either. I wasn't really a city dweller, but I was a village kid, a small town kid. And I didn't know what dark was until I stayed in a cottage one time in France. And it was off-grid. And when you turned out the lights at night, you could not see the hand in front of you. If you held your hand a foot from your face, you wouldn't be able to see.
It was also in like a valley, so it really didn't have much exposure to the sky. Even if it was a bright night, or a lot of stars or something, you didn't see much of that either.
No, we went there when my youngest child was just a baby, and he had just learned how to talk and all of that. And the darkness really struck him. He viscerally experienced what darkness is in that time. This was long ago now, but he laid there in bed between Dave and I, and he kept saying, "Owie." owie, owie, and kind of you could feel his little body tensed up.
It was so dark that it hurt.
It was.
Yeah.
But you know what saved the day for him and for us if we wanted to get any sleep? At the time, I had one of those watches, and I never took it off because it was one of the Indiglo ones.
Ooh, it was radioactive.
Well, that's why I'm so fabulous now, almost immortal.
That's why you have your superpowers.
Yeah. Anyway, you could push the button on that if anybody doesn't know what Indiglo is, and I'm sure you young ones, you're well beyond that. Anyway, you push the little button, and the watch face would glow. And so I usually wear it on my left arm. I took it off, put it on my right arm because he was betwixt us on that side. And from me, my perspective. And so I just held my arm kind of there where if he wanted to, his little fingers, he could push the button on there and light up the watch face. And so we got sleep while we were staying in that cottage. Oh, it was beautiful. It was stone cottage, very idyllic, but dark. And so I always laugh about that. And do I have that watch face? I think I do.
Not dark enough for vampires, apparently, because we didn't see any.
No, we didn't. But my point with all of this is, most people, centuries past, made sure that they were home at dark. And seems off topic, but it isn't, because it'll help you understand a few things. Rich people had beeswax candles, or people who kept bees had beeswax candles, but probably not, because those would be something they would want to sell for good money to buy other goods and things like that. Most people had tallow candles. Now, tallow candles are made out of animal fat, usually sheep fat or something like that. And what I didn't understand about tallow candles is they had to be snuffed out and trimmed every little while because that fat would burn off there very, very quickly. And so you'd need to get that kind of the decayed wick off of there and kind of start fresh every little while. Some people would have like a couple of candles and they jockey back and forth. But you're burning candles. If you're making your candles and that's your only source of light, you're not going to be sitting up reading a book. When it gets dark, you're going to go to bed and you're going to get up when it gets light or just slightly before light to take care of your animals or whatever. So tallow candles, not a great solution. They also used little oil lamps. And a lot of the oil lamps were made out of earthenware or bronze or something like that, with certainly the earthenware ones being less expensive and less durable than the bronze ones. But these were little shallow, kind of flattish lamps, and they would put like olive oil in there in times before, whale oil, some oily thing. And then they had these little floating wicks that were made out of twisted fiber, and they floated in that oil and would burn. And it was a pretty steady burn, but it smelled bad, and it would burn quickly. So the oil would be consumed quickly. Now you have a finite supply of that. So again, you're not going to be burning that. You won't be burning the midnight oil, as they say. You're going to be in bed, tucked in. Your place is going to be cold, except for if you have a fire. If you're sitting close to that, you'll be warm. Or if your bed is above it, you'll be warm. Otherwise, in the periphery of your living space, you'll be cold. So you're going to want to cuddle down and get in your bed. You're not going to burn up your oil because you might need it. There might be a reason why you have to stay up. And usually something like that would be if you had a late night guest come to your door. And when people traveled previously, if you came upon a dwelling place, it was not unusual for people to knock at the door and ask if they could stay the night. And usually a pallet would be made up on the floor near to the fire, and they would be given some humble thing to eat, even if it's just a crust of bread. But so there were conservation efforts with everything because you had to work for everything you had in a direct way. It's not like now you just go out and buy stuff. People did buy things. I'm not saying that. But to a high degree, people were a little more self-sufficient. Goods were expensive. And these kinds of things would be more tallow candles, little oil lamps, things like that, burning, little fat burning lamps, smelly, dirty, not very long lasting. And some people would have reed candles, like almost like a torch kind of thing almost.
Yeah, torches.
Rush lights, they called them. And they would peel like water reeds. I'm thinking cattails. In the United States, a lot of places, what a cattail is. And it's got kind of a fuzzy top to it. And that burns very well, by the way. It's a good fire starter. But they would dip those in fat, and they had these pincher things that they would hold those horizontally. And if you needed to carry those, let's say, through the long corridors of a big estate house or a castle or something like that. But all the while, that thing would be dripping as that fat burns off of there. It melts, it drips. And so I would expect, and this is something I hadn't considered until I started looking at this stuff, that those floors must have been very slippery and smelly.
Yeah. Smelly for sure.
So all of those things. So people went to bed at dark. Now, the people that would be out traveling, people that might encounter some of these night creatures, I'll call them, including vampires, they would be like musicians, a troubadour, or a jongleur, or minstrels, something like that. Highwaymen might be out there, but you didn't want them to come across you either. They're not really a night creature in the sense of a supernatural creature, but you don't want to meet up with them. A lot of people wore like pins on their cloaks, like merchants that would be traveling from market town to market town. See, in Europe especially, where a lot of these things happened, each town would host a market on a particular day of the week. And so a merchant who was selling things, anything from trinkets to needles to knives or clocks or something, they would go from town to town. And often they would finish the market late afternoon, pack up, and then usually on foot, they'd have a big pack, walk in between market towns. Now, a good day's travel on foot would be 20 miles. It's not like now. You get in your car, zoom, you're gone, you can go wherever you want to go. So people, your level of exposure to pitch darkness was high. Now, people had these little lamps. They had these things called a cresset. Sometimes you might come across that if you're a reader of fantasy novels or something like that. Cresset. And that's a little iron fire basket. And they would protect the coals. They'd kind of bank up a coal in this little iron basket and then take the sealed top off and put like a grid work top on these little baskets. And they'd carry them like a lantern and then just continue to feed that coal and protect that coal so they didn't have to start from scratch to light it. Because remember, you don't have your Bic lighter or your Zippo. You are going to be starting from scratch. So they had that, or they had a horn lantern that they would carry suspended from like a stick or something to light their way. But they would be really, really afraid of these night creatures. And if they had traveled to any religious shrine, there were always, like there is now, vendors of souvenirs, little, like I said, tin badges or lead. Lead is better because lead is sort of a ward against night creatures and evil forces. It sort of blocks them. And so they would wear those on their cloaks. And that would sort of be a way of invoking the saint that you went to visit their shrine, the Blessed Mother, the Mother of the Christ, or St. John at de Compostela, let's say, in Spain.
They found a lead cross at Oak Island, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And lead crosses like that were often carried by
vampires.
travelers.
The vampires did Oak Island.
No.
I think that's what that evidence points to.
No. You know what? Travelers often carried staffs of rowan or mountain ash because they believed that, as the Norsemen believed, that that was the world tree and that that tree had special powers. And so they could ward off dangers by traveling with a staff of rowan. Other travelers carried, get this was interesting to me, a crust of bread. And they believed, because of the blessing of the Eucharist in Christian times, that it was a guard. So that holy piece of bread charms the danger and the dread. I'll say it again. That holy piece of bread charms the dangers and the dread. And so they'd carry a crust of bread, particularly if they could get a priest or somebody to bless it. They figured it had already been symbolically blessed by
being bread.
the Last Supper, the whole understanding of the Last Supper. So they thought all bread was consecrated.
It may more likely be that that's all they could find.
Well, I'm sure, but you'd always save a little hunk as a ward. And
Or lunch.
they would carry a daisy. Now get this. A daisy, we always say the word daisy. The term is really day's eye. And that it was like an echo of the sunshine, of the sun, the power of the sun to ward off darkness. And so it's not a metal thing, it's not a badge, but if you picked it yourself during the day,
it dazes your eye.
No, it's not D-A-Z-E, it's D-A-Y''S. So the day's eye, the little center of it looks like a solar disk.
But my idea was equally valid, I think. Because the sun does dazzle, days,
yeah, But I don't know how
of.
that's going to help you in the dead of night against night creatures. Anyway, so
daisy.
that St. John's wort, if you pick that on Midsummer's Eve, which, by the way, will be June 24th this year, it's the solstice, the longest day of the year. If you picked it yourself, particularly on that day, that was also a ward against the hazards of night creatures. And it was considered like a mini sun. It was known as the Sol terrestris, or Earth Sun. So that's kind of cool. Also, four-leaf clovers. If you picked it yourself in secret and you carried it on your person, either sewn into the hem of your traveling cloak or in your shoe, that was also considered a ward against night creatures, vampires in particular, because it was cross-shaped. So crosses have always been considered a ward against evil or spirits of darkness. Now, in terms of vampires, what's kind of interesting about vampires is they are very highly centered in the Balkans, in Slavic regions. And that belief in those kinds of things spread apparently from there, because that's where we see the biggest incidence of these graves with people in chains or caged coffins or stakes driven through the heart. And the stakes that they used were either hawthorn wood or ash wood. And ash wood, it kind of makes sense to me. Ash is known to be a very sturdy wood. It burns a long time, and there's a lot of lore about ash wood specifically, and hawthorn as well. Hawthorn, I know that there was a lot of lore about removing each of the thorns from hawthorn and burning them as you took them off to make like a traveler's staff. Or in the case of these stakes, both of these would be long-lasting woods that wouldn't degrade quickly and could keep that, what you considered an evil corpse, pinned to the ground. And in cases where they suspected that some person was a vampire, what they would do is in some of these Slavic countries, this is kind of an interesting thing, they would have a young boy who's never had any relationship with a woman. They would put him on a young white horse that had never been put to stud. So both of these are virgins, the horse and the boy. And they would ride through a graveyard. And if the horse balked at any of the graves, then they would open that grave and assume that the horse was signaling that it perceived evil, or that the body inside that grave was undead. And they would inspect the body. Now, a lot of these, now think about it, they're recently dead, let's say. They haven't been dead too long. The skin is still in the process of shrinkage, which would make it appear that the teeth had grown. The gums shrink, the skin shrinks, all of these kind of unpleasant things to think about. But to an observer who was uninformed about all of these processes, it would seem like the teeth had grown into fangs, or the fingernails, the skin recedes, and so sometimes it looks as if the fingers are turning into like claws. And so all of these would seem to verify to the person that the corpse was replenishing itself with the blood of humans in the night. Also, there's pooling of the blood that's in the body, and especially when they haven't gone through funerary rituals, to drain that off and that. So the corpse would look sort of swollen, and the cheeks might seem flushed. Some people even said rosy. So it looked like this poor body, was rising at night and nourishing itself. And so they would, sometimes if they were gentle, they'd turn it face down and rebury it and leave it at that, because they felt that spirit then would have a very hard time finding its way out of the grave. Other times they would chain that body with iron chains, which iron is a ward against evil spirits, or put an entire cage, an iron cage around the coffin. And I would expect that if there was a person whose behavior had created a lot of anxiety for people, that they would be much more apt to think that maybe they were indwelled by some kind of a bad spirit. And so those kinds of things, sometimes they would decapitate the corpse, and then they would position the head between its thighs and then rebury it.
Mm. Okay, that's weird.
So other times they would cremate the corpse, which I don't think you can go wrong with that. However, there's also lore that these horrible spirits in various shapes of scary things, earth beings, would escape from the burning corpse. Or, they would simply nail with these long, that looked like a railroad spike, nail the corpse through the head, nail it to the ground. Now, the lore in Slavic countries was that these spirits would travel at night and they would feast on whom they may. The lore it varies sometimes from them being very scary-looking creatures to them being very alluring. And certainly in modern cinematography, we see more of the alluring character, and that there's some attraction there. And so that makes better cinema, really.
And that's what you were saying is the case in this new movie.
I understand that. I have not seen the movie, and I'm hoping to very soon, although I'm not a big consumer of scary movies. I'm not. You might think that I am because I have all of this lore about me, but for me it kind of ends there because I get too frightened, and I don't like that. So I steer clear of it. People wore amulets to protect themselves. We've talked about the little badges from saints, sites, shrines, that sort of thing. People wore garlic, and garlic is a known ward. And it's funny because modern studies have shown that garlic is a ward against a lot of viruses. I mean, they've tested cloves of garlic that have been hung in households, and they found that it does absorb certain viruses, and I don't know about bacteria, but it's the allium family is very good for helping people overcome illnesses. And so it might seem, if you didn't understand that it was a chemical property that was basically an antidote to an illness, just a general airborne or surface-borne illness that you had come in contact with, if you had that around, you might think that it was a charm against some sort of evil spirit. And so garlic was a big, big thing. Now, vampires, the thing is they understood that vampires should be caught by day. But the question is, how are you going to find them? Because they can't be out in the sunlight. And they had, in the Balkans, during the mania against vampires, there were a lot of people who made a living by billing themselves as vampire hunters. And I think I remember not all that long ago, maybe 10 years ago, seeing on eBay, and I don't know why, that they were selling no, I know where I saw it. It was on one of those shows, oddities, TV shows, where they have these people that have like two-headed alligators and things like that, I think that's where I saw it, actually. Vampire hunter kits, where they would have a silver cross, they would have an iron nail, they would have all of these things. And so they were available for hire. If you thought that there might be somebody who was walking in your community who was undead, and
there's some possibility that was done by the same people that proliferated the story about vampires.
Oh, maybe so. Stoke the mania, and then you be the solution to the problem.
Yep.
And that kept things going. Now, when we talk about the iron chains on corpses, when we talk about iron cages around coffins and that sort of thing, or pinning a corpse to the ground, there was a legit reason that had nothing to do with vampires or night creatures, except for grave robbers. Because during that period of time, there was a real market for cadavers. Because all of this emerging science, they needed bodies to cut apart and study. And they did it in not a macabre way. It is macabre. But they did it in the spirit of science and inquiry. And so people were very worried, because a lot of folks would go to visit the gravesite of a loved one and find it had been opened during the night and that the body had been taken. And so it was less for ritualistic, dark kinds of things, and more for study. And they couldn't seem to get enough of those bodies. Didn't we hear or read that Da Vinci was a great one for studying bodies?
Mm-hmm. It's more along the lines of, what didn't he do?
No.
So yeah, that's true.
To
make his illustrations, very, very detailed illustrations of the human body and all that.
And to understand the inner workings of the human body. Did I also hear that Ben Franklin was another guy that couldn't get enough cadavers?
I think so. I'm a little fuzzy on that one, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Those inquiring minds,
Mm-hmm.
And where are you going to get them? I mean, now there's mechanisms, but I don't believe it's easy. I believe you have to have certain credentials, and they'd be expensive.
Yeah.
So those would be other reasons why they would do that. And sometimes when these graves are unearthed as they're building a shopping mall or shopping center or a parking lot or something like that, and they come across these graves. And like I say, in the Balkan Slavic regions, more common. That's one of the things that that gets released to the public. No. This is not about vampires. This is about preserving this body from being taken.
And in Romania specifically, I think, wasn't that where there was like a castle, a real castle,
Yes.
and a real count and stuff that
Yes.
sort of started all this idea?
Nosferatu was centered, that's the setting, was Romania.
Yeah, but what was the actual count's name? I know there was some real person from history that.
It was Vlad the Impaler.
Oh, that's it.
Dracula.
Yeah. Not that,
Bram
I'm sure
Stoker's.
he wasn't born with that name. But
No, but he was known as that because he absolutely did that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so,
please don't describe that.
no, I am not going to describe that, but I will say that the public would have very good reason to be afraid of him, even after he was gone, because it would be hard to believe that it's a here today, gone tomorrow kind of thing with a guy like that. That's, the fear of him was widespread for good reason. Now, that early Bram Stoker, the Nosferatu movie, that was very scary. I saw it not all that long ago, and I was so impressed with how prickly that movie was, and they didn't have access to all of the computer things that they can do now and all the cinematography tricks that they can
There's
come
more
up with.
creativity involved and just the light and dark and
Great
camera
storytelling.
angles and things. Yeah. It
Great
was-
storytelling. And the rosary beads, the coach person or person as the scientist is getting in the coach. And
I think most of those movies were meant to be set in Romania. At least that was, what they wanted you to think and all that. And Romania's got a lot of really weird stuff going on.
oh, they do.
Isn't that where they also have these rocks that move?
Yeah, I don't. Well, let's talk about that sometime. We'll find out
Yeah.
more about that because I can't speak to that without looking a few things up, which I will be happy to do. Over there in that same region, they have what's called dampiers. Have you ever heard of that? Dhampirs, dampiers.
That sounds familiar, but no, don't remember.
Apparently, they are sons sired by vampires. And these males have special powers over vampires. And they also are often paid to find and battle to the death someone who they believe is a vampire.
I would have guessed more that was a female vampire.
Nope.
Because Dhampir.
D-H-A-M.
What were they have in the movies? Vampira, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of those. The whole gothic genre of movies where you have the big castles and the dark corridors and the underground tunnels and rooms and panels and libraries and all of that. It is just so evocative, and it makes
really
for
begs
such
all
a
that
good story.
overacting that they were displaying in some of those movies.
They were, but
extremely overacted. What was that one thing that a friend of ours kept quoting about the coyote, the wolves, or whatever?
You'd hear the wolves howling. And what was it? Something about
Listen to the
Listen to them.
wolves.
listen to them, what music they make,
All right.
or such music they make. Some version of that.
And here's the guy or the woman who was been invited to stay a night in the castle, and he's talking like that, so they're kind of rolling their eyes back and forth a little bit, side eyeing here. I don't know.
Wouldn't you be thinking, I need to get out of here? But the problem is,
There was no other place to stay.
well, not only that, but wolves are a real problem in places like that, especially back, in earlier ages. The wolves, after winter, You know, they'd be very gaunt looking. There's the hunting is scarce. And so they would run in packs. And the whole story, Peter and the Wolf and even the Red Riding Hood story, that takes a fear that people have of traveling by night, particularly alone, particularly on foot. And that just amps it up. And because you don't really stand a chance, and your little oil lamp or whatever you're carrying isn't going to be very effective against a pack of wolves, and especially in areas where it's heavily wooded. You know, where you have
they
these
probably wouldn't
vast
choose the oil
forests.
lamp, though, because the oil lamps and the candles are not directional, obviously.
No, they're not.
They're going to blind you. That's where the torches are better, because they have a long handle, and you can raise them over your head. At least you're not blinding yourself. You can illuminate the wider area.
So nowadays, if you have any travel that you must do on foot,
Take a torch.
take a torch or one of those headlamps. And plenty of extra batteries.
Yeah, in the UK, that's what they call a flashlight anyway. So
Torch.
Yeah.
Think how lucky we are that that's an option for us. You know? I just, if you put yourself in that mindset, now, I mean, the new movies and stuff like that, they're set in the Mississippi Delta. We have an image of that. But if you can put yourself over in Romania or in some forested place where there's this castle, isolated, surrounded by forest and lonely roads that you would have to travel alone. Now that adds an awful lot to a scary story. These Dhampirs, they also believed that these people that claimed that they were sired by a vampire, that they also were kind of charlatans, that they would take money to do battle. And the question is, were they doing battle to an actual person? This had to be in the public square, by daylight, a fight to the death. And was this some hapless person who happened to be your neighbor who people didn't like, or they acted weird, or were secretive or isolated or lonely, or, just not really an outgoing person? Then that is a very sad story indeed. But for these Dhampirs, if it was just an imaginary fight, it would be sort of like a wrestling match against nobody, and you'd be tossing yourself about and putting on a good show, and people would be paying you for that.
But if you were the son of a vampire, it wouldn't necessarily make you a vampire, right? They would still have to be bitten. Is that right?
Right. But they have power over vampires. They're able to identify them better, and they can see more clearly whether these suspected vampires cast a shadow or no shadow, because vampires don't cast shadows.
That's because they're always in the dark.
That's right. That's what I always thought too.
What the heck?
What's
you can't
the deal
use that
with
as a test.
Yeah. It just goes to show some of this does not.
I suppose the torch, maybe. I could hold the torch up.
Maybe you could hold the torch in such a way.
I guess. I don't know.
Now, there's questions about whether vampires take the blood of their victim all at once, or whether they come back successive nights and take it little by little, and then the person gradually gets pale and wastes away.
Well, the whole idea is that they're just bats, really, right? Because I think that's one of their powers, isn't it?
That's it. Bats, people are afraid of bats. And certainly after the discovery of vampire bats, I believe in, South America, Central America, places like that, rainforest places. Mm-hmm. Once the study of those became public, people really were scared because bats come out at night, they fly. Now, there was a belief, and this is kind of interesting too, that if a person was able to capture a bat, kill it, take its left eye, keep the left eye of that bat that you killed, keep that with you, that it would render you invisible whenever you wanted to be.
How'd that work out?
I don't know.
First time they tried to rob a bank or whatever.
Yeah, and there's you with your bad eye hanging in a necklace or
but
something.
you're not supposed to be able to see me.
I know. I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't trust it. Also, people... Yeah, let me think. Austria. I think it was Austria that they would hang them around their neck. Or maybe it's
Hang
still the
what?
Slavic. A dead bat around their neck
Oh,
because they
great.
thought it would be really attractive to the women.
How'd that work out?
I don't know, but it wouldn't turn me on, let me tell you that.
I'm glad to hear that. I've always wondered that, and I just didn't know how to ask.
And see, now that puts that
Yeah.
right to bed for you. Mm-hmm. Wow. I like thinking about those crazy things because when you think about that, you think, oh my goodness,
Yeah, I just always took a lot of the. I mean, it's classic stuff, isn't it? Really, it really is all that old cinema and the movies. But I always took them sort of like almost like a joke. It was just a little bit funny. I
Yeah.
think, oh, this is so unlikely, so weird, or whatever. But I do have a favorite vampire-based production.
What?
And that was a TV series called Forever Night.
Oh,
And that I thought was really, really well done. And their premise was believable. Not that their vampires exist necessarily, but their whole storyline was really good. And one of the few series, I don't think it was terribly long running, maybe 3-4 seasons or something like that in the 90s, I believe. They actually did wrap up the series with a 2-hour special, which is rare. Usually when they decide not to pick up a series or whatever, that's it. It just stops.
yeah. And it leaves you hanging, and if
Yeah.
you've invested in it,
And they
it
sort
feels
of
like you got
wrap the
shortchanged.
story up. But if you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's. I think it's really good. It's called Forever Night.
Do you remember who starred in
I
it?
don't know, but he was great. I think it was one of the one-hit wonder pop star singers who they had do the pilot for it, but they decided not to go with him. And I don't remember this guy's name, but he was really good. The acting was good, and it was very intriguing. It was a syndicated show. It was not network carried, as far as I know. But
It's very cool.
yeah, it was good.
Very cool. We should dust those off. I know you can watch almost anything that, any old series you can get a hold of nowadays much more easily, and that's nothing but great. Washington Irving's The Headless Horseman, in a sense, was about the undead. Not a vampire in the sense of, sucking on the blood of a
Well, he
victim.
couldn't. He had no head, for heaven's sake. How's he
You know
going
what?
to do it?
In some of those Slavic countries, if they cut off the head of a corpse, hopefully to stop it from marauding in the night, that was not a sure thing. That's why they didn't just do the decapitations. If they did that, they'd have to stake the head down, because there is
What's the
some
head gonna
stories.
do? Roll around and bite you
No,
in the ankle,
it would
or what?
rise up. This corpse would rise up and take its head and throw it at people. It was like a discus almost, or like a some sort of medicine ball or something. Throw it at people, and it was terrifying for the people.
Well, yeah, I get that. But
So they'd
what are the
stake the-
chances that it would be fang first and it would actually
I think
go into the skin?
that's one of the reasons why they chopped the head off, and then some. I'm not understanding why they'd have to place it on the thighs of the corpse, the head, but that was because of that belief that the corpse could reanimate and throw its head at you. So keep your head. Hey, do you remember? I'm going to say this. We're running out of time. Do you remember that time that we went to a cemetery in France, and there was the top of the it was a ground level grave, and it was in the shape of a man, and he was holding his head as if he could look at it, as if he still had his head and could look at the head that was looking back at him between
I
his
remember
hands.
That, yeah.
And
Père Lachaise Cemetery, I think.
Is that
it
what it was?
And the 11th, yeah.
I need to go look at that again, because I want to see if that has any echoes of all of this Romanian lore that we've talked about today. Well, guys, we're out of time. And
Just as well.
I think one of the blessings that we should count and be thankful for today,
That there are no vampires.
no electric lights.
Oh,
Leave them all on. If you're scared at night, leave them all on. Or get yourself one of those old Indiglo watches. That works well, too. I know from experience. So,
no, don't. Don't wear it, at least. Keep it in a lead box.
because of the
radioactivity.
Okay. All right. Do count your blessings, all of them, not just the lights. And thank you so much for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.